Hello students, welcome to today's session. Today we are starting a topic under neural plasticity, that is cellular and molecular mechanism. So specifically we will focus on learning and memory and its basic principle and model systems. So now why this is important in neurorehabilitation? Because understanding how the brain learns and remembers is the function for helping it relearning of lost functions after any injury or disease. So in this session, we will look at the fundamental concepts of learning and memory, how neural circuits adapt, and also discuss some experimental model system that scientists uses to study these processes. So by the end of this session, we should be able to explain the basic mechanism of learning, differentiate between different types of memory, and appreciate how these principles related to neuroplasticity and recovery. So if we see brain injuries, so every year brain injuries and neurodegenerative diseases affects millions of people worldwide. These conditions are among the primary cause of deficit in cognition and memory. So now we may think about what learning really means. It's the ability to acquire new information, understanding, relationship, and develop strategies. And what is memory? So the memory allows us to retain that information and act on it whenever it is required. So without learning and memory, we couldn't adapt to our constantly changing environment. And of course, some behaviors are innate, like reflexes for instinctive responses. But most of what makes us who we are, like recognizing familiar faces, remembering how to get, let's say, home, or maybe recalling how to use a tool, relies on experience and memory shaping our behavior. So here's a, let's say, a big question in neuroscience that the neuroscience is still tries to answer, that how does the brain take raw sensory input like sound, vision, or touch and transform it into meaningful information, and how is that information stored, interpreted in the right context, and then recalled whenever we need it. So this process, encoding, storing, and retrieving information is at the heart of learning and memory. So if you summarize the learning and the memory, so the process is nothing but the encoding, storing, and retrieving the information. And understanding this is key not only for the basic sciences but also for helping patients to regain lost cognitive functions. Experiences a brain injury, one of the major challenge is the deficit in learning and memory that follow. So now if we want to improve or even restore their lost functions, the very first step to do two things: classify and understand learned behaviors and memory, or in other words, what type of learning are affected. Is it the ability to form new memories, or is it the retrieval of old memories or old information? Identify the critical neural circuit involved, which specific part of the brain are responsible for this behavior. For example, is it the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, or a combination of several areas working together? Once we have this basic map or this basic information, that is what behavior is lost and which circuits are involved, then we can move towards more advanced interventions. But here's the key point, that restoring function is not just about repairing tissues. It requires a proper understanding, a deep knowledge of how learning and memory are encoded in the brain at the cellular and circuit level. Only by first characterizing the behavior and its neural substrates can we design therapies that actually works. So whether that's neurorehabilitation exercises, stimulation techniques, or even brain machine. So now let's talk about the two major types of memories that neuroscientists often describes. The first one is declarative memory and other one is non-declarative memory. So let's start with declarative memory. So this is probably the kind of memory that you are most familiar with. It's the memory system that involves conscious awareness. You can intentionally recall facts and events. For example, you can easily state or think like a fact, like Paris is the capital of France, or remember a personal experience like uh, that amazing trip I took to France last summer. So, declarative memory is often called the knowing what. Now, on the other hand, we have non-declarative memory, also called implicit memory. This type of memory works in the background. You are usually not consciously aware of it, but it's just as important. For instance, think about skills and habits like riding a cycle, driving a car, or playing the musical instrument. You don't have to consciously recall every single step. When you do these activities, your brain just do it. So, non-declarative memory also includes things like priming, where exposure to one stimuli affects your experience, your response to another. It covers simple form of associative learning like classical conditioning. So, if we can recall uh, Pavlov dog's example or experiment, so they learn to associate a bell with food, and it even includes non-associative learning like habitation. When you stop noticing a, for example, background noise, or its opposite, sensitization, when you become more responsive to a repeated stimuli. So a simple way to remember this, declarative memory is knowing what facts and events you can consciously recall, whereas non-declarative memory is knowing how. That includes skills, habits, and learned responses that you perform automatically. So both systems work together to shape how we learn, behave, and interact with the world. Now let's take a closer look at the two types of memory, declarative and non-declarative, and see how they differ in terms of awareness. So declarative memory, also called implicit memory, is the type of memory that you can express without even being consciously aware of it. For example, when you are riding a bike or type on a keyboard, you are not actively thinking about how to move your fingers. It just happens. That's your implicit memory at work. Now, declarative memory, also called explicit memory, is different. This is the memory that you can consciously recall and you are aware that you are remembering something. Declarative memory can be further divided into two types, episodic memory and semantic memory. So the episodic memory, which is memory for your personal experience. For example, what you had for the breakfast today or where you went to schooling. So you remember the context and when it happens. Whereas the semantic memory, which is the memory for facts and general knowledge, like the name of the president of US, what 2 plus 2 equals, like that. So episodic is more about your life event, while semantic is more about word knowledge. Meanwhile, non-declarative memory covers a wide range of phenomena like priming, where exposure to something affects your responses later, and skill learning like playing a piano piece or improving your golf swing or any playing skills. So now here's something interesting. Like these two types of memory are not mutually exclusive. They can actually be formed in parallel. For example, when you are learning to driving a car, you first consciously remember the rules and steps. That is declarative memory. But over the time, it becomes automatic and shift to non-declarative memory. So the brain often blends or combines both the systems to support learning and behavior. Let's look at a very basic form of non-declarative memory called non-associative learning. So this includes two simple but fundamental processes. First is habituation, the second one is sensitization. So what is habituation? So it's a decreased response to a stimuli after repeated exposure. For example, imagine you are sitting in a room and suddenly hear a bird sound outside. At first, you might look towards the window, but as the bird keeps sounding again and again, you stop paying attention. Your nervous system says, okay, this is not that much important, and your response diminish. This is habituation. It helps us ignore repetitive, harmless stimuli so we can focus on more important things. At neural level, habituation happens because of synapses involved in the response undergo synaptic depression. So there is a decrease in neurotransmitter release with each repeated stimuli. Now, on the other side, or maybe on the flip side, we have sensitization. So this is a increased response to a stimuli after being exposed to a strong or unexpected one. For example, imagine if we wake up in the middle of night because of sudden loud sound or any other sound. So after that, even a small sound or very small creak in the floor might make us woke up. So our nervous systems has become extra alert, reacting more strongly than usual. So this is sensitization. So it's like the brain going into a state of increased vigilance. On a neural level, sensitization involves facilitation of neurotransmitter release and requires the interaction of sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. So both habitation and sensitizations are adaptive behavior. They are found in all animals with nervous system, from simple introverts to humans. They help us to tune our responses to what really matters in our environment, or to another important subset of non-declarative memory, that is procedural memory. So what is procedural memory? So it's the memory that allows us to learn sensorimotor skills like riding bike or cognitive skills like playing chess. So the interesting part with the procedural memory is that it is formed and expressed without conscious awareness of learning the context. And it can persist even if we don't have conscious recall of practicing the skill. So we can have a very classical example. So we may have heard the mirror tracing task. So basically, in this particular task, the person is asked to trace the outline of the shape, but they can only see it in a mirror. So at first, it feels completely confusing because the reflection reverses our movements. But with practice, we gradually get better. So now Here's the interesting part, that even people with amnesia who cannot consciously remember previous session still improve with practice. So this shows that procedural memory is working even without conscious recall. And let's say another similar type of example we can have the rotatory pursuit task. Here we have a joystick to track a moving target on a circular path. So with practice, our coordination improve. We learn to anticipate the movement and follow it very smoothly. And again, even individual with severe memory impairment show improvement over time. So what does this tells us? It tells us that procedural memory is separate from declarative memory. In fact, we know this from brain lesion studies that, for example, damage to a medial temporal lobe, that including the hippocampus, can wipe out declarative memory. People can't remember facts or events, but those same individual can still learn procedural skills. So on the other hand, damage of the basal ganglia or cerebellum, areas involved in motor control, impairs procedural memory but leaves declarative memory intact. So this is what we call a double disassociation, when two related mental process can function independently. In simple example of double disassociation outside memory is language. You can damage one brain area and lose speech production, but still understand language, or damage another area and lose comprehension while speech remains intact. So, procedural memory and declarative memory rely on distinct neural circuits, which explains why someone with amnesia can still improve at motor skills like mirror tracing or rotatory pursuit. And more importantly, procedural memory is what allows us to perform automatic, efficient tasks without even thinking about each step, like typing, swimming, or playing or um, playing any musical instrument. There is another very interesting form of non-declarative memory called as priming. So, what is priming? Actually, it's when prior exposure to the stimuli influence your later behavior or maybe the response. So often without you even realizing it. So let's take a very simple example. So let's imagine I have given you a list of words to quickly memorize. Later, I show you another list, but this time it only has words fragments like banana with fill in the blanks or maybe some letters missing. So if you saw the word banana in the earlier list, you are more likely to complete it as banana rather than some random word. So that's the priming. Your brain was prepared for, or you can say the brain was primed by the earlier exposure. So this process related information faster. And we can take, let's say, another example. So if you reach a bunch of fruit related words like apple, orange, and banana earlier, you are more easily recognize a complete fruit related words afterwards. So this happens automatically without conscious effort. So priming can happen in different way. Semantic, where related meaning help, like reading doctor make you faster at recognizing nurse. Perceptual priming, which relies on sensory features like recognizing a blurry image faster if you have seen the clear versions before. Conceptual priming, which leads the broader knowledge and idea. And priming is not just limited to words, it can happen visually, auditory, even with smells and other sense also. So now here's something which is very really interesting about priming is that priming works even with the people with amnesia. They may not uh, consciously remember seeing the first list of word, but they still shows a priming effect. This tells us that priming is a separate form of declarative memory in terms of brain. Priming involves visual association area of the cortex. Damage of these area impairs priming, and brain imagine uh, shows changes in activation here when priming is happening. So if we take the particular image or particular scan of the part of the brain, we can very specifically we can see the change in activation level when this priming process is going on. So the priming shows how your brain can be influenced by the prior experience, making future processing faster and more efficient, even without conscious awareness in our life. So now let's move to another type of non-declarative memory, that is associative memory. So what does associative memory means? So it's the ability to form a connection between two events or stimuli so that one can trigger the memory or response of the other. So the most basic classical example of associative learning is Pavilion conditioning. So you probably remember, or maybe you have gone through this particular famous experiment of the uh, dog experiment. So at first, the sound of a bell meant nothing to the dog. It's just a neutral sound. The dog will not react towards that particular bell sound. But what the experiment is all about, they provide a repeatedly paired sound of bell and food, which naturally made the dog salivate. So after enough pairings, something different or amazing happened. The bell alone was enough to make the dog salivate. So if we further break down this particular experiment, the food was the unconditioned stimuli. It naturally caused salivation. The bell started as a neutral stimuli, but after a training, it becomes the conditioned stimuli. So the salivation to food was an unconditioned response, while the salivation to the bell becomes a conditioned response. This simple example shows how associative memory allows an animal or a human to link two unrelated things and create a new learned response. So now associative memory is not just about classical conditioning. It can apply operant conditioning. For example, a Skinner box experiment, a rat learns and that pressing a lever gives a food as a reward or maybe something a punishment. So this type of learnings are also there. So that we will see in further slides. So now there is another important form of non-declarative memory, that is operant learning, also known as instrumental conditioning. So what's the key difference between classical and operant conditioning? In classical conditioning, that just we have gone through that dog experiment, the subjective passive, it simply learns an association between two stimuli like bell and food. Whereas in operant conditioning, the subject is active. It learns. That is, its own behavior produces a certain outcome. For example, A rat in the Skinner box learns that pressing a lever results in a food as a reward, so it keeps pressing the lever most frequently. But here's where it gets more interesting. Memory consolidation that actually plays a big role in operant learning. So in real life, humans and animals tend to remember best those events that occur during the time of moderate arousal or maybe stress condition. So this is sometimes called the flash bulb phenomena. For example, older generation might remember where they were when they heard about president assassination or maybe any other event, whereas the younger generation may recall exactly where they were on that particular date. So now these memories may not be perfect, but the emotional arousal at the time helps lock in the details more strongly. So what the biological basis of this? So there is a famous experiment by Dr. Carl Duckton in 1940s. So what he did, he trained rats in an instrumental avoidance task using a shuttle box. So the experiment was like that. The rat is placed in one compartment of the box. When the light turns on, it has 10 seconds to move to the other side of the box to avoid the electric shock on the food. So over several days, the rat learns this task very well. They avoid the electric shock very quickly, like as soon as the light is on, they quickly move to the other part. But in further experiment, what the scientists added, they added a twist in which what they did that after each training trial, he gave the rats a electroconclusive shock that is known as the ECS, which is at the different time interval. And once they consolidated the result, they found that the rats that received the ECS immediately after the trial, like between let's say 20 second after, so they learned nothing at all. Their memory was completely erased. But if the ECS was delayed, says let's say after an hour, the rats learned just fine. So this particular experiment shows that memory takes some time to consolidate. Right after the learning, the memory is fragile, as the experiment shows. So just after the experiment, if the electric shock is given, the rats learn nothing. So just after the learning, the memory is very fragile, but over the time, it becomes more stable and strong. So we see sometimes similar to the humans also. Patient who receive the ECS by the psychiatrist after the treatment often experience retrograde amnesia. They forget events just before the treatment. Interestingly, this amnesia has a gradient. Recent memories are more easily lost, while older memories, that is, well consolidated memories, are more resistant. So, over the time, most memories return, but the moment around the ECS or the electric shock are often permanently forgotten. So, what does it this tells us about operant learning? It shows that the memory is just not about the forming the association, but also about consolidating the information, turning a fragile short-term memory into a stable long-term memory. And this process can be influenced by stress, arousal, or even external interventions like electric shock or ECS also. So further, if we see the declarative memory of humans and see how one very famous patient taught us so much about this particular memory. So from the experiments or from the literature, if we search, we will found a particular name of the experiment or particular type of experiment named as Henry. So, though if we search in the literature, we can find it as a HM in the scientific literature. So the whole scenario was like that Henry was suffered from very severe epilepsy, and um, in order to control the seizure, doctors around 1950 they removed a particular portion of the brain, which is actually a very substantial and large portion of the brain from his medial temporal lobe. That includes the hippocampus on both the sides. Surgery was successful and uh, resulted in stopping the seizures. But it left Henry with a profound memory deficit problem, and that actually revolutionized the whole neuroscience research domain. So, what exactly happened? Henry's old long term memories, like those forms his childhood and early adult life, were mostly intact and leased up to about a year before the surgery. But from the time of the surgery onwards, he could no longer form new long term declarative memory. No new facts, no new personal experiences. So, this condition is called antegrade amnesia. The inability to create new declarative memories. So, for example, Henry could meet a doctor one day, have a friendly conversation, and next day he would not uh, recollect this memory. That means that he would not able to recognize that particular doctor or person. If someone told him a fact within minute, it would be gone. But here's the most interesting part. Even though Henry couldn't able to form new declarative memories, his non-declarative memory remained intact. He could still learn motor skills like mirror tracing. He still shows priming effect. He could improve on tasks that relied on implicit learning. And yes, if you ask him later if he had done the task before, he would have no conscious recollection of practicing it. So, what did we learn from this particular case? That memory is not a single unitary process, it's actually a collection of different systems in the brain. The hippocampus and medial temporal lobe are crucial for forming new declarative memories, but once those memories are fully consolidated, long term storage may shift to other brain regions like parts of the cortex. Retrieval of old memories does not always need the hippocampus. That's why HM early memories remain intact. This is called temporarily graded retrograde amnesia. So this particular subject HM provided clear evidence of a double disassociation. You can lose the ability to form declarative memories while still retaining non-declarative learning behavior. So in a way, uh, Henry lived in a permanent present with no conscious awareness that what happened from day to day. But he was also proof that different types of memory depend on different neural systems. So in this particular session, we have explored the very important topic in the world of memory and the system. We saw how non-declarative memory includes habits, skill, priming, and conditioning, things we learn and express without any conscious effort. And we contrasted with the declarative memory, which allows us to consciously recall, the facts, and the personal experience. Through the case of Henry, we learn that memory is not a single process but rather a collection of systems involving different brain regions. The hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe are crucial for forming new declarative memories, but once consolidated, memories can be stored elsewhere in the brain. Overall, these studies remind us how complex and yet how beautifully adaptive our memory system is. So, thank you for your attention today.